Normally when people think about design, they think of the visual aspects. They think of things like UI design or menus or maybe a website design or a pamphlet. However, there's a lot of things in design that aren't visual, things that you end up seeing. There's a lot of hidden things, such as like an architecture. You may not be able to see behind your walls. However, the support beams are really important to keeping your house up. And if you've ever been in a house with very terrible wiring, you'll probably know that you probably want someone to design your wiring, or else you're going to be in your room and then have your lights shut off when the microwave 3 rooms away ends up going off, which is a little bit upsetting when you're 6. Anyways, Michael here, and today on Design View, we're going to be talking about designing variables in software. So these are the things that are kind of hidden, the things that people don't normally see. We will be talking about how you can end up converting these into things that people can see, but this is going to be a very nice introduction. If you want to see anything more advanced inside this video, go ahead and look up other sources, or you can end up leaving a thought in the comments below, and I can end up doing a video on specific things, because these are things that I'm very passionate about. I love designing variables and kind of like working with the hidden things, frameworks and stuff that just makes things work even though people don't necessarily see them. And it's actually really, really important inside of software development, because if you do it wrong, you end up with a product that doesn't work, which is obviously not a good thing. So there's 3 sections I'm going to be talking about today. For one, I'm going to be talking about selecting variables. This is going to be something that is mostly specific to your kind of software development, because in software there are a ton of different types of variables. This isn't like a physical thing to where it's like you got to select wood, or I guess it is kind of like selecting wood or iron or whatever, use the right tool for the job. So I'll be talking about that. Then we'll be talking about converting variables, or what I like to call host variables, which are variables that will be used to determine a bunch of other variables. So conversion, I can't write today, conversion or host variables. And then we'll be talking about the end user variables, or what I like to call visual variables. These are the variables that people will see. Let's say you're playing a game, for example, and your health bar has a number up there, or it has a visual bar. These are what those visual variables are. So these are the stuff that's not hidden. So it's how you use these kind of hidden variables to make these visual variables, I'm going to say. Now, I will mention here that none of these are technical terms. I'm sure they have technical terms, but I'm not the most technical, and I forget my vocabulary, so I kind of come up with my own sort of stuff. So again, might not be 100% helpful, but let's go ahead and talk about it. So first off, let's go ahead and talk about selecting variables, as selecting variables and conversion variables are very important to understand. So let's go ahead and talk about selecting variables. Inside of software, there are a ton of different variables depending on the platform you're working on, but there are a few general cases to where we can end up talking about specific variables, especially when it comes down to Windows development or designing for 32 or 64-bit systems. So first off, we got our integer. This is the most common number that you'll end up seeing, or the common variable that you end up seeing. An integer is things like your 1 or your 0, sorry. Not a 1, your 0 through 9 and your real numbers. So for example, if you have a 19, that is an integer. However, if you have a 0.01, it will just end up deleting that. It will get truncated and remove that. And then you'll have 19 alone, because a integer is just whole numbers. They are not decimals or anything along those lines. There are some advanced things you can end up doing. However, most of the cases, there are other variables that you use. Integers are great for things that will increment in standard kind of whole numbers, or things that you want to be extremely precise, because integers have a high accuracy when it comes down to software development. Some math issues come along the lines when you end up getting into floats, which is going to be our next one. A float is good if you need these decimal places. However, it does have some inaccuracies. So this is going to be, like your zeros, and then it has all of your decimals or whatever you have. So you can end up having any sort of number and anything along those lines. And this is the largest of any integer. However, it does have some accuracy problems. So it's good for things like percentages. However, it's not good for storing long variables. So if you had 19.01, that's going to be a float. However, you run into some problems when it comes into math. So let's say you have 3 bajillions or whatever, and there's supposed to be like an 8 here and a 9 there and a 7 here and a 6 here or whatever. Eventually at some point when you end up getting into a large decimal point, if you actually look inside your software, you'll notice that a lot of these just get converted into zeros, and you're left with just a 3 over here. And then at your other end, you end up getting some kind of calling errors in a sort of sense, to where it just ends up kind of cutting off numbers. And this is because of the way it's stored inside of different engines. And so that's a little bit important to keep in mind. So floats are not great for storing large variables. However, they are great for percentages and other variables to where you need decimal percentages, or things that you don't need to be 100% accurate. So these are really important, because I use floats a ton when it comes down to things like health bars, or let's say you're calculating damages and you want like good percentage values. If you keep them low, then you can be 100% accurate. Of course, different software and different engines and different sort of algorithms are going to have different accuracies, and so that can change depending on what you're using and the platform you're on. So keep that in mind when you're developing. Then you have things like bools, or you can end up calling them binaries. I call them bools because that's how I was raised. I was raised a proper man. But these are your true, false. True or false. You can also explain them as 0 or 1, where 1 would be true and then 0 would be false. But of course, these binaries are used for either a 1 or a 0, and it is very, very simple to end up using these. It's mostly used for true and false statements. However, you can also use them in a lot of different creative ways. You can also use them for toggles, things like a light switch, for example. That is a great example to where a light switch, when it's up, it's on, when it's down, it's off. And this is probably the most basic within any sort of variable that you have. However, you can also use it in a lot of interesting cases, especially when you end up using it with floats or ints. So bools are really good for things that are going to be true or false, or only going to be in one of two states at any given time. Or inside of a true false statements and stuff like that, let's say you're using a bunch of else ifs, you can end up using it within different while statements or different loops to end up making it so that you can end up toggling between two different functions while inside of a while or a Boolean kind of function that you end up going through, which is really, really useful. And this is mostly going to be for logic more so than storing data for, most cases. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into conversion variables. And then you also have things that aren't going to be number based. And there's other number bases as well, I understand. However, we're going to go ahead and skip over to string or name or text or, I can't remember the other one. Numerical representation. And you could also call this hex. You can call it, I can't remember the other mathematical names they had for it. I wanted to say it to sound super cool, but I literally read up on it today. But a string is words, quite frankly. It is the letters or characters that you would end up seeing inside of a string. So if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to send a message that said hello world, that would be a string. So you'd be like, hello world. And then that would be a string. Hello world. That sounds like me, something I would do. And then so hello world would be your string. And so a string can be any sort of character set. And what this really is it's a string of hex or values within bytes that would end up representing these characters, such as Unicode or something along those lines. And so that's what a string is technically. But in the visual representation, we have it as words. And so those can be useful for, storing words or storing strings of characters together, which is where the name string comes from, which is very, very useful. And you can use this in a lot of creative ways. For example, when you go into actually selecting your variables, let's say you have something, like let's say you have a long function, for example. Let's say you have a bunch of characters that you need to filter through, but you want to create a general function that would end up pulling from all of them. What you can do is you can give each character an ID or a string in their ID, and then you can use that ID inside of a true-false statement system that would end up checking whether it was this character or not. And you can use this in a lot of interesting ways. So strings, when you go down to using strings, for one, they're good for using messages or words or things along those lines, which is really, really good, such as sending the message to a player, hello world, or let's say you're making a visual novel, making it so that, all your words are strings can make it very easy to convert. Now, inside different engines, there are different types of string variables. And so, for example, Unreal Engine 4 has one called name or has one called text, and both of these have different translation variables you can end up adding into it. And so it kind of ends up being sort of like an array. We'll talk about those a little bit later, or structs specifically inside of Unreal Engine. And so you can end up making it so that it converts into different languages depending on the code and stuff like that, which is really interesting and really, really cool. But I'm not going to talk too much about that today. But then strings can also be used as IDers or identifiers, more specifically. That's the correct term for it. And so when you end up getting into things like giving things names inside of your code, you can actually use strings in really creative ways to give things different IDs. For example, when I go through, I was giving the character example, I will give each character a different ID. I will give different functions different IDs, and I can use those similar IDs and strings to end up combining them together and end up using that to call different functions and call different variables, or use it to determine what I'm working with rather than having to do direct calls to specific objects within an engine, for example, like if you're working with Unreal Engine 4, for example, instead of actually having to define what you're actually targeting, if you always have that target on scene, or maybe this target will end up disappearing and reappearing, you can use a string ID to make it so that that character is always active with that ID, rather than, storing all those variables with that ID, rather than storing it on that specific character. That probably makes no sense to anybody that hasn't worked within game engines before, but that's kind of what it is. Strings are really, really versatile, and I love strings. Now, you also get into some complicated stuff that ends up going into the way that you end up using these, such as, for example, you have arrays. Now, arrays is just a collection of variables. And so you would have like an int array, for example, would be just a collection of ints. So you'd have an int, you'd have an int, and you'd have another int or whatever. And these values could be anything. They could be 19, they could be 20, they could be, 21 or whatever, or they could be 5. And so it could be any integer or whatever, and you can end up having a collection of them. There's also things like 2D arrays, which would actually have it so that each integer would also have other variables within it. There's different arrays within different systems that could actually have multiple variables within them. However, that is a little bit less common. Most engines end up using some workaround for this, or using reference arrays, where you would have an array reference another array. So you would have one array that would reference another array. So this would actually reference this array while also referencing another array. And so you would have this list while having this list, and you can compare 1 with 2 and 2 with 1, 3 with 3, whatever. And so that's a little bit more complicated, but that's how you end up doing a 2D array. Now, arrays are actually really useful for when you need to store a bunch of data together, or if you need to actually have, like, let's say you have character stats, for example, you could store inside of an array, and you can name each array and be like, oh, well, one's health, and that health will be like 19, and then his defense will be 21, and his 5 will be his, I don't know, his jump speed or something along those lines. And so you can end up storing data such as that way. And arrays are really useful for moving around large amounts of data or creating things like functions. So when you end up getting into using functions, you can have it so that it calls a specific position within it. Or maybe you want to make a while function, which will just end up going through every single one inside of an array. So you could actually have a bunch of strings, or maybe you have a bunch of characters or whatever, depending on the engine that you're working. So you could have strings here, and you could actually have it go to each single string and run it for each. Let's say, for example, I was talking about the string being used as an ID. You can have a string for all the IDs of the characters in a scene, just collect them from the scene or whatever, and then run a while statement on all of those IDs and find all your functions using that ID. Again, arrays are incredibly versatile and a good way to actually use a bunch of different kind of, usage cases or whatever. And so arrays are really versatile, and they can be combined with any other variable, because array itself isn't a variable. An array is just a collection of variables. And depending on the engine that you're using or whatever kind of software you're working with, or however you end up building your systems, arrays will work in different ways. So you'll have to read up on your documentation for that, but that is really important. Now, again, there are a bunch of other complicated ones, but I'm running a little bit over time, and I think that this kind of covers the basics. There are a lot of other things within specific engines, such as Unreal Engine 4 has structs, for example, which I really, really love, which are basically the same thing as an array, but you can actually make it so that the, it's basically one of those talking about to where an array could be any sort of whatever it wanted to be. So it could be like a float, and then you could have a string or whatever, but you can use structs, and you can store structs and arrays inside of a struct, and you can store arrays inside of an array. I don't know if you can do that in most engines, but I think Unreal Engine 4 is the only one that I've actually worked with that can store an array within an array, which is actually pretty cool. Anyway, so let's go ahead and talk about the other one, the conversion variables. So I've kind of talked about the usage cases of most of these and how you would actually use these. Now, for specific cases, I would need to do other videos on them because it would be going way over time, and I'm already running out of time, so of course we'll end up going into that. But if you were talking about like health and things like that, like an integer and floats and things, this is what we're going to be talking about: conversion and host variables. So let's go ahead and use a health bar as our main example. So let's say we got our nice little stylish circle here, and it's got a nice little bar here, and we've got our health variable here. And so it's wobbly for whatever reason, because I was itching myself. But yeah, so you end up having your health bar here, and let's just make this a different color. Yeah, we'll give it a nice little sheen here. So you end up getting your health bar with your little wobbly here. Maybe you're an electric robot, and it's got nice little statics. And so that's probably fine, but this isn't actually a normal variable. This is going to be a float, correct? Because it's going to be a percentage. To be able to render a health bar or something along those lines, you would normally have a percentage section. And so there's a lot of things that go, why did that come up? There's a lot of things that would go into this, and I'm not necessarily going to go right into the visual variables right away, but let's say you didn't want to store your health inside one specific variable. Let's say you wanted to use an integer for this, or for this bar, or maybe you wanted to use a float for this bar. Let's use, for my standard usage case, is I normally end up using an integer for a true health value, and then I have a float value for my actual health visual variable. And this is where a conversion or host variable would come into play. So you would end up having your host. This is why I call it a host. So you have a host variable, and so you would have, let's say it's an integer for 500 health or whatever. So this would be your maximum health. So it'd be like, I'll just use hit points. We're just going to go full on with this example here. So you end up having 500. Now, a conversion variable would be, let's say we would convert this into a float, and then it would then be a float. Now, this wouldn't be 500 inside of a float. This would convert to 1.0, because this would all of a sudden be our maximum, because this is our 100% maximum health, which would be pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and put max here for clarity's sake. So this would be 100% essentially. So it would be 100%, or it would get rid of this dot or whatever, which we'll do that. That looks terrible, but you get what I'm saying. It would be 100%. Undo that. And so when we end up having this, we now have a percentage that we can use for our bar. So this is going to be 100% of our bar. Now what we can do is we can either convert this float, or we can create a second integer. And this is why I call it a host variable, because the host variable is what you're going to be using to kind of calculate all your other types of variables. So for example, we're talking about health here. So we've got 500. Let's say we want to do, let's say we want to convert it into a normal value. So we've got our max, but what is our true health value? Let's say we take 10 damage, and then this number would convert into another integer. And then we would have our non-max HP, and then it would be, you know, they take 10 damage or whatever. So now all of a sudden they'd be 490 instead. However, we still have our host variable. We still have our 500. Therefore, we're able to calculate this float right here. And then we're able to be like, oh, what is that percentage? I don't know, and I'm not going to grab my calculator, but let's say it's 0.09 or something like that, or 0.99. I should have selected an easier one to do. You know what? Let's go ahead and do that. So let's say you had 100 as your host. This would be our host as our HP max. I scripted this out and it made sense when I scripted it, but now I'm just realizing the problems. But then you take 10 damage, so you'd be like minus 10 or whatever. Let's go ahead and make that shiny. Okay. And then you would end up going down to 90, right? And then this would be a brand new int. So we would define the int here, and then you would define the int here, or whatever. And so now you have three different ints, or two different ints, and then you have a float value, which you would then be able to convert from this. And so your float value would go from 1.0 down to 0.9. I don't know why I'm screwing that up. And so then you would have kind of three different variables here. You would have your host variable, which would be your int max HP, which would be 100 in this case. And then you would have an int that would be your true, or whatever the hell you want to call it, HP. And then you would have your 90. And then you would have a float, which would be your percentage, or per HP. And then this would be 0.9. Now, why would you end up doing this? Why wouldn't you just have one variable that would just be like, why wouldn't you just take your true HP and just be like, oh, well, it was 100. Now let's go ahead and minus 10 from it. And now we got 90. And now you have an int that's just 90. Well, the problem with this is, how do you go back to your maximum health? You need a variable to end up capping your health correctly. So let's say you're in software development or something. You have a +1 key or something along those lines. If they pushed it 11 times, all of a sudden you're going above your maximum and you're going to 101. Now, going outside of video games, for an example, or maybe inside video game logic as well, this can carry over to video game logic. We'll talk about it in a second. But let's say you're designing some sort of software that's going to calculate the number of times some action needs to be taken, but it can only do it a certain amount of action depending on the amount of resources that you give it. If you allow them to click past that, all of a sudden you're going into overflow, or you're going to have a problem to where it tries to use resources it doesn't have. So for example, if you're building a house and you only have 5 logs, but you need 6, you're not going to build that house very effectively, because you're going to get to the end and realize you're missing a log inside your house and it's going to fall over. Again, going back into the house example. So this is really important, because then you can use that host variable that you use to calculate all these. Again, see what I'm saying here? So you would be like, oh, well, this can't be 100, so this is going to cap at 100. And so then instead of ending up with 101, you would end up with 100 back to your host variable, which is how you end up using that to calculate, like, let's say a maximum health value. It's just really, really easy to use as that. In other cases, let's go ahead and talk and transition over into the sort of visual element. Let's say you end up having a percentage value, right? Now, we did talk about integers and not having a kind of decimal value. And so therefore, you would end up having a health bar, for example. Let's go ahead and use a larger one. Let's just go ahead and find a blank space here. Let's go ahead and just use a large bar, right? And so we ended up having about a halfway point there and whatever. And this is your 0% bar and this is your 100% or whatever. If you end up having it so that it's at, let's say 90%, for example, go somewhere over here-ish, probably. I don't know. I'm kind of close to my screen, so I can't see it perfectly. But let's say that's your health bar. And let's say this is 90%. It's probably not. Now, let's say you needed 90.5%, right? Let's say they ended up doing 10.5%. Or let's say you end up not having a simple variable. Let's say you end up having a complicated variable like 1012 or something along those lines, something that's not going to divide evenly into a single number, and you end up dealing 10 damage, all of a sudden you have 100 or 1002, you need to be able to calculate, because that's not going to land onto a specific number, right? It's going to be slightly different. So it's going to be like, again, I don't necessarily know, but we'll say 98.8% or something along those lines. And then you're going to want to end up being able to represent that, correct? You're going to want to be able to be like, oh, it's right here, right? The problem with using an integer is that an integer is just going to say, oh, well, this is only 98%, which means we're going to round it up to 90%. Or what did I do? Did I hit my crop button? I did. Didn't mean to do that. Go into my brush here. Sorry, I still suck at this. And so, or we can end up saying it's 98 or 99.8% or something along those lines, right? So let's say this was 99.8%, because this is a good example, because this would be like, oh, 99.8%, right? So this would be your true value. So if you're using a float, this would be like, oh, hey, yeah, we just need to land here. But if you're using an integer, it would cut off this 8, round it to 100, or round it to 99, and it would either be above or it would be below where it actually needed to be, and it would show inaccuracies inside of it. Also, let's say you ended up taking 5 health, the health bar might not end up moving because it wasn't enough to push it down an entire variable, and so you'd want that sort of kind of percentage value. And when you get into game engines and writing the actual code for this type of stuff, you end up getting into problems when you end up doing percentages with integers to where they just don't flow properly within mathematics. When you end up getting into software mathematics, integers do not divide very easily. You end up normally, in most engines, not all, but when you end up using an integer, you can't do 9 divided by 9 very easily. Yes, that would end up equaling 1 or whatever, and that's pretty simple. However, most engines or most software will end up converting these into floats. It'd be like 9.0 or whatever, and then it would just convert it into a 1 as it sees that they are equal. And so it goes into problems where you're always going to end up converting these into floats normally during math. Anyways, now there are cases where this isn't the case, but most times it is. And therefore, it's kind of easier just to kind of convert it into a float, and it actually adds a lot of accuracy to it. You can also use it for a lot of different things. Let's say you wanted to deal 10% of some character's health. You can end up just using this float value and actually reverse it back onto the original value, or maybe you want to end up using it in a lot of different creative ways. And there's a lot of different interesting ways you can end up using conversion and host variables. And this goes into actually how to represent it for the player as well. So for example, for a health bar, for example, you would end up using a percentage to actually show the health bar. But let's say you had a number below your bar. Let's say you actually had health down here. And so it actually showed your health value. And then so this would be like, let's say 1002, right? You would use either your host variable or your normal integer, let's say your true HP value, and you can end up using that to represent your actual HP here. Now you can also store your health as a float itself as well. So you can end up having this as, instead of having an integer, you can make it a float, and then you can end up having some of those inaccuracies that really wouldn't matter because you would actually have another variable that would store your true HP, and then you can end up using that, but then you would end up converting it into an integer so that you end up truncating this, for example, or you would end up doing a truncation function depending on however your UI ends up working. And this kind of goes into how you actually display it for the end up user. Now, I'm not going to go too much onto this, but when it goes into it, let's say, for example, you're working with the strings. So let's say you have a bunch of IDs. So you have an ID for your character. So you have an ID frog. So you have frog here. So let's say it's a underdash frog, ID cat. Just use animals. ID Drake. There you go. So you have these. Now you can actually pass them off, and let's say you end up sending them to the user or whatever, and you're using them for a function that would call off their details. So it'd be like frog details or whatever. So, oops, not frag. He's on a grenade yet. Frog details. And so this is like a function or something along those lines that would end up pulling this, and they use that ID to actually get this detail. Now, let's say you just wanted to tell the user that it was a frog. Well, this is where you would use another conversion variable or a host variable. So you would end up using this frog, and you'd be like, oh, well, I just need to remove the ID, right? So you just remove the ID, and then it's like, get rid of that. And then it's like, oh, you have a frog. So this is frog. And then so the user would see frog, for example. You can end up converting it into another string, having some sort of connection variable, and you can use it in a lot of interesting ways. Again, this kind of goes into the creative design of variables in a lot of different interesting ways that you can end up using them. Let's say this specific frog has a name or something along those lines. You can use this ID to get the details. So you end up going here, get the details, and then you loop out, and you end up finding out the frog's name is Jefferson or something along those lines. God, I love that name. Jefferson the frog. So you end up getting Jefferson the frog, and you use that again to show the variable that people would see, because the people, they know it's a frog because they can see it's a frog. They don't need to know that it's ID frog. Oops. They don't need to know that it's ID frog. All they need to know is the frog's dang name. And so therefore, you end up using the frog's name. And maybe you have multiple ID frogs, for example. They don't need to know it's ID frog 1 or ID frog 12 or ID frog 123. They just need to know it is Jefferson. And they need to know the details for Jefferson. Maybe the health and stuff like that is within the details function. And so this is where you ended up using those conversion variables to kind of show the user details that they would need to know, but not necessarily things that are used inside the code. These could be one-way functions. And so frog details could not affect anything inside the code. It could not do anything along those lines. It could just end up throwing out, a bunch of variables that the user would end up seeing. This is where the health bar example comes into play, to where maybe you don't actually use the true HP function. Maybe you just use a float for the actual health, and then you end up using the health percentage to calculate the health bar, and then you use the true HP just to calculate this number here, or maybe you truncate your float into an integer, and so you end up showing off what number that would be. That way you don't have like a 1002.0001278, whatever. So, it's a little messy. So you can end up, getting rid of all those details that the user doesn't necessarily need to know, and therefore you can end up having it as 1002. And that's basically the basics. There are a lot of different advanced things you can end up doing. So for example, bools you can end up using as a switch. So you can end up having like a visual toggle or whatever. So you could have like a checkbox that every time it's, true, it's checkboxed. Whenever it's not true, it's not checkboxed, things along those lines. Sliders for like float values or something along those lines. So you could end up having a slider, and then you have a little bar here or something along those lines. Or for strings, you can end up having input panels and stuff. So it'll be like rah, rah, rah. You can do a ton of different things within these. And that's kind of how you end up using the visual variables. And it gets a little bit more complicated as you end up going along, but that is the basics of it. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this one. Actually, don't really need to comment to get more content like this one, but if you do actually see any of these ideas and you want to get more into it, such as like maybe health bar design or something along those lines, which are topics that I would love to go over, then you can end up just leaving a comment and being like, oh yeah, I would love to end up hearing more about this, or I would love about this, or maybe you have some questions, go ahead and throw those down in the comments, or maybe you have some other details that you want to end up throwing down into the discussion. This is a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, so I apologize for that, and also I apologize for the visuals of it being not exactly the way it was. Hopefully it looks better. I think it looks a little bit nicer. I kind of changed my color palette a little bit, but yeah, anyways, like I said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next design view. I forgot to show my stuff, so if you like my styles of content, make sure to check my website at michaelpstanich.com, a link in the description, as well as a link to our Broken Chatbox Discord, which is a gaming Discord. We have gaming nights and stuff like that, and we post videos on there and stuff, so check those out. Also, I have a podcast.